Okay. Okay. So now that we're at least a lot of us here, so this is sort of, there's kind of two goals. One is to revive this sort of Thinking Tuesday, Texts on Tuesday series that we had done for a long while once the pandemic started, and that tapered off for a number of different reasons. So we're kind of trying to revive that. But the other part of it is we just haven't really, as a congregation, I think, talked very much over the last few years about Israel-related issues, at least as they apply to humanistic Judaism and as they apply to Mahar, outside of sort of the informal discussions that happen on the Mahar chat listserv, or quote unquote in the halls, I guess is how you'd put it, during community Sundays and adult ed and things like that we haven't done a lot of actual discussion. So the idea here is we'll have a chance to do some actual discussion, but also take a moment, or 45 minutes or so, to talk about exactly where Israel fits in with humanistic Judaism, because I suspect we haven't all stopped and unpacked that anytime recently. So I thought that that would be a good place to start for any kind of future discussion of any matter related to Israel, I guess is how I'd put that. So if you can't see the PowerPoint, let me know. I don't know that there's much that I can do to fix it, but if someone lets me know, I know, and if you don't, then I have no idea. So what we'll cover, and not necessarily in this order, is what the place of Israel is in humanistic Jewish thought. And we're not talking about Israel theology, I want to point out, because that's not how humanistic Judaism works. But, is there humanistic Judaism in Israel? How does humanistic Judaism approach issues related to Israel-Palestine? How does it approach issues related to current events as they're happening right now? What's the position been historically? What is it now? What does it look like moving forward? What can we expect to see out of humanistic Judaism and the movement institutions? So those are kind of the things that we'll talk about, and just to be able to kind of cabin off discussion so that people feel okay to ask questions. We really are going to do this unusually for how I tend to do things. We really are going to do the slides and then stop sharing the slides, stop the recording, and then we can kind of unpack and talk. And I can bring back the slides if we need to look at a specific one. I just don't want us. I know that there are folks who are uncomfortable discussing political topics in a place where they could be recorded. So we're just going to avoid that problem. But this is what we'll cover, not necessarily in this order, roughly in this order. So Israel and humanistic Jewish thought. Notice that it's in and not and. What happened here? Okay. So this is from Sherwin Wine's book, Judaism Beyond God, which you'll notice there's a 1995 date on it. It looks like the old version looks like this, kind of a baby blue cover. The new version doesn't look like this. The text is all the same. I think the page numbers are probably the same too. And so Sherwin kind of starts off the Israel section by saying, for many diaspora Jews, Israel is their Jewish passion, and the relationship is confusing. He's talking about the relationship between diaspora Jews in Israel and Israelis and diaspora Jews. And he lists a number of different things. So he's got as many paragraphs as you see bullet points here, that each of them start with the relationship is confusing because, which is a very particular turn of rhetoric. And so one paragraph starts The relationship is confusing because Israel prevents diaspora Jews from functioning as a religious denomination. Diaspora Jews are not members of the Israeli nation, though they have strong attachments. Diaspora Jews view Israelis as more completely Jewish than they are. Israel's the creation of the diaspora. Israel seems unique. Zionists and Israelis place a negative value on diaspora Jewish life, and Israel is often described as the center of the Jewish world. So, unpacking each of these, because I didn't want to stick 3 pages worth of his book into a PowerPoint slide that seemed like not the best use of time. Israel prevents diaspora Jews from functioning as a religious denomination. And for a lot of us accustomed to worrying about secularism, secular democracy, things like that, we read Israel prevents diaspora Jews from functioning as a religious denomination. And for a lot of us, our heads go to, right, the Israeli government does not recognize Reform Judaism as an official institution that can engage in the kinds of things that the Orthodox rabbinate could engage in. But that's actually not really what he's talking about. What he's actually talking about in this paragraph is something that's actually really familiar to us right now, which is that Israel and Judaism get so tied together that very often in the diaspora, right, the United States, places like that, very often in the diaspora, what ends up happening is that Jews aren't just a religious group in the way that Presbyterians are just a religious group, because there's this coupling of Israel and Jewishness and Judaism, and the existence of Israel sort of prevents Jews in the diaspora, this is Sherwin talking, it prevents Jews in the diaspora from being able to just say, my religion is Judaism, or my religion is Reform Judaism, or whatever it is. That there's always this cultural component that comes with it. It's a transnational piece because there are Jews in lots of different places, and it's this kind of quasi-ethnic, quasi-religious, quasi-national identity. And that's really what he's talking about with the first point, not the Israeli state doesn't recognize Reform Judaism, which we know. The next one, diaspora Jews aren't members of the Israeli nation, even though they have strong attachments, right? And this is the other part of the confusion that keeps happening. Maybe some of it, the confusion's intentional, that if you live in Washington, D.C. or Maryland or New York or Virginia or wherever, unless you are an Israeli citizen, you're not a member of the Israeli nation. So how do you exercise influence? How do you tie or not tie to it, right? This is kind of what Sherwin is getting at, that you want to have some influence. We want to have influence. We have these strong attachments, but we're not actually Israelis, and that causes confusion. Diaspora Jews view Israelis as more completely Jewish than they are. So a lot of kind of the more traditional approaches to Zionism say, look, the only place you can really be Jewish fully is Israel. Diaspora Jews absorb that message and often end up thinking, okay, whatever I'm doing is not as good as it would be in Israel. I'm just not there. And sometimes that takes on just literally being Jewish, just secular Jewish. And sometimes it's, I can't be as Orthodox as I'd want to be because of where I live. This isn't the same. Historically, there is this phenomenon of within, you'd call it Orthodox Judaism now, but for those who follow kind of the traditional Jewish legal codes, there are things you can't do if you live in the diaspora, that you need to be in the land of Israel to fulfill certain commandments. We do not require people who live in the diaspora, this is halacha, right, traditional Jewish law, those Jews who live in the diaspora and have farms are not required to set aside the corners of their field for people to then forage from if they can't afford food. In Israel, technically, under Jewish law, you're supposed to do that. So what we're talking about with this third bullet point isn't that. It's not the we can't fulfill a commandment. It's how Jews view themselves. And this is a similar phenomenon to totally secular Jews who conclude that ultra-Orthodox Jews are the authentic Jews and fund those institutions and don't engage in religious practices themselves and never would. But there's something genuine about ultra-Orthodox Judaism, and so they support it despite the fact that the ultra-Orthodox are happy for the money, but really would like nothing to do with these secular Jews if they could help it. Israel is the creation of the diaspora. So it's not as though there were Israelis who created Israel after having been Israelis living in the same place for 2,000 years. There were Jews who lived in the area for 2,000 years, but not that many. Israel's a creation of the diaspora. The United Nations kind of allowed it to exist. The British Mandate folded. Jews moved to what was British Mandate Palestine. And that's where Israel comes from in the most immediate sense. It's not a spontaneous national movement in the land already. It's people came from outside and a national movement existed. Israel seems unique. So this is also a little bit, he's talking about the creation of Israel, but he's also talking about that it's not like France. It's not like England, where there's an ethnic state. Everybody who's a citizen, it kind of bubbles up initially from this particular ethnic group or this particular language group or whatever that's been living there all of this time. And it sometimes the nation forms gradually, that this is different. And it's religious, but it's not, and it's cultural, but it's not, and it's secular, but it's not. It gets confusing because Israel seems unique, and how do you apply the things you're used to thinking about to Israel? Zionists and Israelis place a negative value on diaspora Jewish life. So if you are a Jew living in the diaspora and you discover that your Israeli cousins say, you should come home. And what they mean by you should come home is your home is in Israel and you should be here. And you think you're living perfectly well in the diaspora. That's a confusing thing to hear. If you remember when the kosher supermarket in Paris was attacked and world leaders descended upon France, and Benjamin Netanyahu was there as well, and he spoke at a synagogue in Paris, and he gave the "you're not safe here, come home" speech. And people started walking out because there's a little bit of confusion that's happening there. Why are you here you're supposed to be here supporting us and you're telling me to leave my home? So there's confusion that kind of comes with that. And then Israel is often described as the center of the Jewish world. So there are a number of different kinds of Zionism. One of them is cultural Zionism. Cultural Zionism kind of imagine that, people would live, maybe they'd live in Israel, preferable if they lived in Israel, maybe they lived in the diaspora. Jewish life could continue in the diaspora and it would have some level of creativity, but really the most creativity in Jewish life would happen in Israel. And so the largest number of Jews is now in Israel, probably. And so Israel is described as the center of the Jewish world, which, okay, but I live in New York. So what does that mean for me? Because, I think there are a lot of New Yorkers who would say that they're the center of the Jewish world. So you can kind of see these are things that get confusing. And these are the things that Sherwin is talking about as being confusions. So what's humanistic Judaism's response to the confusions? right? We have all of these things about Zionism and the interaction of Zionism and the diaspora and just the nature of the founding of the state. How does humanistic Judaism respond? And I guess it was not going to surprise you when I tell you that actually there's not answers, that there are just some principles to work from. And these are Sherwin's principles. There's not a whole lot of other writing about thinking about this outside of Sherwin and a few other things in a journal. And so what Sherwin says is, look, Judaism and the Jewish people are the product of the diaspora. We wouldn't be calling Jews Jews, but for having been brought into the diaspora, right? They might have been Judeans, but that's not the same as being a Jew. So Judaism and the Jewish people is a product of diaspora. So Jewish identity for Israeli Jews is not merely a territorial distinction. And what he means by that is, if you are an Israeli Jew, in his mind, there's a piece of your identity that's international, and there's nothing you can do about it, because your Jewish identity is essentially formed in part out of the fact that Jews went into the diaspora. Judaism is a diaspora invention or development for Sherwin. And the next thing he says is, for most Israelis, Jewish identity is important for the very reasons that offend many classical Zionists. It points to the obvious connection of the Israeli Hebrews with the world Jewish people. And you can kind of imagine what he means by this is, hey, classical Zionists think everybody's supposed to come to Israel. And Jewish identity is important and a separate thing because Jews remain outside of Israel. And for Sherwin, this means being Jewish, Jewish identity is transnational, and there's an aspect of being an Israeli Jew that you simply can't avoid those international ties, no matter how secular you are. And the Jewish state can never be fully normal because Jewish diaspora history has been less than normal, right? So if you think about the nation state and the history of kind of the international stage, Jews have always been an outside minority in almost every place they've been, right? You come to Poland because you're invited there by the ruling by the ruling monarch, and the ruling monarch is eventually displaced or decides that he doesn't want to pay his debts to his Jewish subjects, and now you're in this awkward situation because you're Jewish and you're in Poland, and you're not really considered Polish because you're Jewish. And now what? That means for Sherwin that Jewish history isn't normal. Jews in the diaspora, their history has not been normal, because it's hard to come up with another national or ethnic group that has this sort of history. And so from Sherwin's perspective, the confusions aren't totally resolvable, but the solutions are gonna have to rest in large part in a recognition that what classical Zionism wants isn't what's actually happened, that there's no way of avoiding these kinds of international ties, and that a good chunk of how you deal with the confusion is to recognize that the confusion is there because nothing about Jewish life has been like anybody else's life for 2,000 years. But beyond that, there aren't answers. I mean, he doesn't provide answers to the confusions. He's got 3 pages of confusions and a page of principles. So we're on our own. There aren't going to be neat answers to the confusions. However, he also says to live in a century when the Jewish state became real is a special privilege, right? Because he wrote this in the late 20th century. The first version of this came out in the 1980s. This is the second version, 1995. To live in a century when the Jewish state became real is a special privilege. If you want to know whether Sherwin's a Zionist, I think that's your answer, right? I mean, to live in it doesn't get too much more plain that Sherwin is a Zionist, right? This is what he's kind of trying to get across with limits. So we'll talk about the limits a little bit. Is humanistic Judaism inherently Zionist? So we know pretty clear that Sherwin is, but is humanistic Judaism? Does it just key off of Sherwin and that's it? Sherwin was a Zionist. Though Israel's the center of the Jewish people, diaspora Jews don't have to assume a passive role, right? So this is, you donate to the Federation, you hope there's influence. They have a right by virtue of the Jewish connection to influence its behavior. No one that I'm aware of has really argued that if an American becomes an expatriate, has a child in France, the child doesn't end up with US citizenship status for some reason, that child is American and by virtue of their American connections can influence the behavior of the United States. That's not a thing that people tend to think. But diaspora Jews tend to think that they should have some ability to influence how Israel functions. And he says the separation of religion from government and the guarantee of equal rights for Arab citizens are urgent matters. This is 1995. Right, so this is published the same year that Yitzhak Rabin is assassinated, although almost certainly before that date, because Rabin was assassinated toward the end of the year. But already you can see there are concerns. This is after the First Intifada, all of that stuff. As a successful attempt by Zionist pioneers to encourage Jews to take their own fate into their hands, the Zionist movement was initially filled with a humanistic spirit, and keeping that spirit alive is one of the tasks of humanistic Judaism. For those who watched online or were physically present on October 15th, when we had the Rabbi Gordy and Rabbi Jeremy show, where we kind of compared what's going on at Kehillah and what's going on at Mahar. A longtime Mahar member who grew up at the Birmingham Temple, Dan Tabachman, mentioned that Sherwin talked about humanistic Judaism as the core, the cake part is the substance is humanism, and then the frosting or the sweet external layer is Jewish culture put on top of it. And this is that idea coming out that what's most important about humanistic Judaism is the humanism part. What's most important about what the Zionist movement accomplished was that it took responsibility for itself and took its fate into its own hands. And that is the key piece in Zionism that he sees. And he says, humanistic Judaism's job is to keep that spirit, that we are responsible for ourselves and we take action, that spirit alive. But that doesn't mean he wasn't a Zionist. That means he absolutely was a Zionist and saw himself a little bit in Zionist pioneers, right? The same approach to what you do with your life. And he says, from the humanistic point of view, Rabbinic Judaism did not create the national determination to survive. It provided a respectable public justification of it, and in modern times, secular Zionism is an equally successful expression of the same ethnic drive. Ethnic groups want to survive. They will develop ideological cover to make sense out of that drive. So Rabbinic Judaism 2,000 years ago, when it was developing in the wake of the destruction of the temple, creates a set of explanations for why Jews have to stay around. From his perspective, secular Zionism is another expression of that need. Different language, different for the time, right? Secular Zionism is really kind of a nationalist movement in the sense of like nationalism from the late 1800s. We need explanations. We need justifications for why we want to stay around. Secular Zionism is one such explanation appropriate for its time. That's really kind of what he's getting at here. Which, again, doesn't mean that he's not a Zionist. It simply means there's a sort of realpolitik view to what ideologies are about. And part of it is explaining why you want to stick around. Humanistic Jews in the diaspora support the survival and prosperity of the state of Israel. Okay, so those of you who have joined Mahar or joined a congregation affiliated with the Society for Humanistic Judaism, or are independent members of the society, whether you know it or not, you have gotten in the mail a book called Guide to Humanistic Judaism. If you joined before 2017, the copy you got had a red cover. If you joined after 2017, the copy you got probably had a white, green, and blue cover. Either way, it says basically the same thing. Humanistic Jews in the diaspora support the survival and prosperity of the state of Israel, which sounds like a pretty official statement of something that is a lot like Zionism. So, to the extent that we have an official statement, this is a pretty official statement. Much of what's in the guide was written by Sherwin, but it's been re-edited, and some of the language has been changed over time, and some of the historical stuff has been updated. So this is as official a statement as you're likely to get. Humanistic Jews support the survival and prosperity of the state of Israel, even if they don't feel the need to move there. There are caveats. Humanistic Jews don't affirm all forms of Zionism. They reject the notion the state of Israel should be a theocratic state. That should seem obvious for secular humanistic Judaism. They also reject a Zionism that denies the value of the diaspora and insists that all Jews make aliyah. Right? This is often called negation of the diaspora. Humanistic Judaism is not in support of negation of the diaspora because the Jews are a world people. The modern state of Israel is not the creation of the Bible or of the Messiah. It is the creation of the diaspora. To be Jewish is not the same as to be Israeli. Jewishness is a world identity. There's a world people. The world people happens also to be tightly tied to a particular modern nation state, which humanistic Judaism supports the existence of, as long as we're supporting the right ideologies behind that idea. So that's almost as official a position as you're going to get. Occasionally, people will say, okay, so what is SHJ? What does the Society for Humanistic Judaism have to say about X issue, whatever? So there are some official statements from the Society for Humanistic Judaism that are maybe a little more current than what's in the guide, just based on when pieces of the guide were written. The most recent thing that you will find on the Society for Humanistic Judaism website is from 2014. So one of the various Gaza campaigns that has occurred over the last 18 years, more or less, since the withdrawal from Gaza under the Sharon government. So it says, reaffirming the statement first issued by the SHJ in 2002. SHJ, there's a typo in the text online. SHJ Executive Director at the time, Bonnie Cousins, stated, we support the right and responsibility of Israel to defend its citizens. The state of Israel is under attack. We reaffirm our support for the continued existence and defense of Israel. The future of the state of Israel must be secured. And it goes on to say that the UN Human Rights Council would adopt a resolution that sharply criticizes Israel while absolving the terrorist group Hamas of having a role or any responsibility for the current conflict is most distressing. The world must recognize and put an end to such terrorism. This is 9 years ago. Not a whole lot seems to change, right? That these issues were the issues 70 years ago, and they're still live issues now. Just Hamas wasn't around 70 years ago, but now it is. So this is the most recent position. It references a position statement from 2002. 2002 was the Second Intifada. So 2002 has kind of the most recent general statement from the society on Israel-Palestine politics. This is sort of very specifically about the Gaza campaign from 2014. Nothing newer has been issued at this point, and we can talk later about why that is. Except to point out that we've had numerous other incidents since 2014, which means you'll notice that SHJ hasn't been issuing statements, and there's a reason for that. SHJ encourages all involved parties to seek a solution that will bring peace with justice to the entire region, a negotiated solution that assures a secure state of Israel and a demilitarized sovereign Palestinian state must be secured. We encourage the United States and the countries of the world to take vigorous stand in bringing Israel, Hamas, and other involved parties to the negotiating table. Only then will the region find a lasting peace. Keep this language in your head. That's the most recent official position, and it may start to sound like there's an echo in here. We have our little sample from the SHJ statement in the first bullet. The second bullet is from AIPAC. America can play a central role in helping create the conditions for a lasting peace, including a negotiated two-state agreement between Israel and the Palestinians. A viable two-state agreement is only attainable if America's support for Israel is ironclad and the Jewish state knows it can take risks for peace because its ally and partner has its back. This is on the current AIPAC website. This is what it has to say about a two-state solution. It does not sound all that different from the SHJ statement, which means that even now, with what's going on, AIPAC is still, at least on paper or online, talking about a two-state solution as being the endpoint. The next bullet is another statement from AIPAC from a few years ago. Possibility for a two-state solution must still be maintained, a two-state solution that ensures a safe, secure, and democratic Israel that can live side by side with a demilitarized Palestinian state that provides dignity and self-determination for the Palestinian people. And boy, if that doesn't sound like the SHJ statement, I don't know what does. The final one is from J Street. We support the creation of an independent, demilitarized state of Palestine with defined borders. We believe a negotiated solution to the conflict serves both Israel's and America's interests and fulfills the legitimate national aspirations of the Jewish and Palestinian peoples to self-determination and sovereignty, which is the kind of statement that you would expect from J Street. This is still current on J Street's website. I didn't go to some archived version of it. And what each of these organizations has to say is not so different from what SHJ has to say. No, I did not go look at the Zionist Organization of America for its mission statement. I didn't go look at Jewish Voice for Peace because I wanted to show you just how much what SHJ has to say is really very much in line with either kind of a more traditional American Zionist approach or even a more liberal Zionist approach, right? The kind of the approach that J Street has. It's everybody's saying the same thing. So is there humanistic Judaism in Israel? We've been talking about SHJ in the United States and Canada and how it deals with Israel questions. Is there humanistic Judaism in Israel? And the answer is yes. And that was easy, right? We don't have to talk about it. We'll talk a little bit more about it, but the answer is yes. So it was founded largely by Yaakov Malkin, who died in 2019, who founded Tumurah. Tumurah's basic meaning is value, not like ethical value, but value in exchange. So it's also the word used for consideration. So for the lawyers in the room, yeah, that kind of consideration. Founded Tumurah, the Israeli branch of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism and other SHJ kind of bodies. It all kind of goes through this one thing. So Yaakov Malkin died a few years ago. His daughter, Sivan Malkin Mas, is the current dean of the rabbinical program, the first humanistic rabbi ordained in Israel, and did much of her study in the United States because there were not as many Israeli humanistic Jewish institutions to learn at, right? You want to have an internship at a congregation, it's pretty hard when there's no congregation. So she's really the first Israeli rabbi ordained as a humanistic rabbi and is the dean of the school. So there is a school, which I guess is nice to know. Not a complete picture of current humanistic Jewish activity in Israel, but kind of highlights, and they seem to be the same highlights year after year after year in the same meetings. Tamara has ordained more rabbis than the U.S. branch of the International Institute for Secular Humanistic Judaism. There's an ordination ceremony almost every year, and there's almost always more than 2 people being ordained at those ceremonies. It's been a few years couple of years at least, since we had one in the United States. And sometimes we only have 1 student, sometimes we have 2. Rabbi Malkin Mas has been actively involved in training IDF officers on how to work with secular Israelis under their command. Stop for a moment and think about that sentence. 70 years ago, IDF officers would not have needed training in this because they would themselves have been secular Israelis in all likelihood. That's not the case anymore. So IDF officers, who a lot of them have gone to religious Zionist yeshivot and things like that, have to be trained on how to deal with secular Israelis. So she does some of that work. There are 4 congregation-like groups of Israeli humanistic Jews in Israel. So there are 4 small, like Chavarot, essentially, in Israel. Because remember, the state of Israel doesn't support any version of Judaism but that which passes through the Israeli chief rabbinate's support. Several projects related to humanistic Judaism were supported by funds from the Ministry of Education and Sport during one of the various Netanyahu governments within the last few years. Is a small amount of money. It helped fund the part-time salary of a humanistic rabbi. Israeli humanistic rabbis are actively and prominently involved in pluralistic and interdenominational efforts. Boy, I can't believe I wrote that like I was going to read that. Basically, there are a few groups of open-minded, pluralistic, non-chief rabbinate tied Jewish movements. So Masorti, which is what the conservative movement in the US calls itself in Israel, Reform, some more liberal Orthodox folks, as well as organizations like the Shalom Hartman Institute, which every so often decides it's going to ordain rabbis, runs a program for a few years, and then shuts it down and then comes back. And so these rabbis gather together frequently to talk about the problems that come with how you function in a positive way when the government that you live under has no time for you and does not recognize the weddings that your rabbis perform as weddings. And, these are the problems that come from institutionalized religion. What do you do when you aren't in that group? So that's part of what humanistic Judaism is up to in Israel, is trying to kind of, as best it can, move some of the secularization ball forward, because it's really kind of secularization has really fallen way behind in the modern state of Israel. And so I guess you could ask the question, are Israeli humanistic rabbis Zionists? They would say yes, and others would disagree. Most humanistic rabbis in Israel have not only voted merits, but very vocally favor merits. So the ones that I'm friends with on Facebook have generally post vote merits kinds of things on their Facebook timelines. There are a lot of Israelis, particularly on the right, who would argue Meretz is in fact not Zionist. Meretz has not done a great job as a political party in clarifying what it thinks about Zionism. Is it post-Zionist? Is it liberal Zionist? Is it non-Zionist? What the heck is going on? And the same document from Meretz kind of goes all over the place. So there's not a straight answer. But the humanistic rabbis almost certainly think of themselves as being Zionists. And this last bullet point is from one of the humanistic rabbis in Israel, Nardi Grin, who writes, "It is us or Hamas. There is no possibility to live with this kind of ISIS tactics on our borders. Not only that, but around the world, we're hearing calls of free Palestine from the river to the sea. The meaning is to annihilate the state of Israel. I have to agree with what Chaim Levinson suggested in Haaretz. We have to act like the Allied initiative after World War II that did a denazification. The Gaza Strip has to be denazified from Hamas." So, to the extent that there is a left-leaning, peace-oriented camp within Israeli humanistic Judaism, Nardi is one of the rabbis that's connected to it. He had Meretz stuff all over his timeline during the last election. And this is yesterday. So you can see, views Hamas as an existential threat as an Israeli. So we know all of this stuff. And so the question is, now what? Given circumstances, now what? So the future of humanistic Judaism and Israel. I said it's very unlikely we're going to see further official statements from the society regarding Israel. There is concern about the divisiveness of Israel as an issue. There are folks who are AIPAC aligned. There are folks who are J Street aligned. There are folks who are Jewish Voice for Peace aligned. Makes it really hard to issue a single statement at times. Consensus decision-making plays a role. And the example that I always give for the Society for Humanistic Judaism in this kind of decision-making, which is necessary sometimes for a national level organization, every secular humanistic organization I can think of has rejected the death penalty, except for the Society for Humanistic Judaism, which had some folks who were very vocally opposed to the idea that SHJ would come out and say, no, we don't support the death penalty in any respect. They had specific arguments, and the decision was made, we're going to have a discussion about this and keep the discussion going, as opposed to forcing a statement through that a couple of people might really, really, really vociferously oppose. There are reasons for these kinds of decision-making processes. I'm simply pointing out, when you have a divisive issue, very often, even if you have the votes, you're not going to force the issue through. So this is an example. Israel is another example of this. As well, since 2014, the last official statement that came out about the Gaza campaign at that point in time, adjustment of guidelines on statements plays a role. 2015, 2016, the society changed its criteria for when it would issue statements on social issues, and that has largely pulled Israel-related issues out of play. There is an association for humanistic rabbis, which is the Clergy Association for Humanistic Rabbis in North America. So this is the place that I get a letter from that says, yes, this person is a rabbi in good standing, so that I can then do weddings in the state of Virginia, for example. Most full and student members of the association are connected to some form of liberal Zionism. Most are members of the J Street Rabbinic and Cantorial Cabinet. So this is the often not much more than a list of rabbis, cantors, and students who One, you don't have to pay to go to the J Street the annual national conference for J Street. That's nice. You get some extra news briefings, also nice. But otherwise, they're not asking for our opinions. There are one or two APAC-aligned members of the Association for Humanistic Rabbis, and there are one or two Jewish Voice for Peace-aligned members of the Association for Humanistic Rabbis. Humanistic Judaism, for now, is likely going to remain de facto aligned with some form of liberal Zionism. That's kind of where things tend to land in most SHJ-connected communities. It tends to be where a lot of Machar folks are. It's not where every Machar person is, but it is where a lot of Machar folks are, is with some form of liberal Zionism, so some kind of J Street alignment, right? Our discussion lists regularly pull out Peter Beinart and J Street statements and things like that. So for now, for the foreseeable future, this is what it looks like within humanistic Judaism, is some form of liberal Zionism is sort of the average, but we're not likely to get any kind of hugely expressed statement in a general blanketed way from the society on these particular issues. Since somebody's going to ask, I figure I'll just tell you. Somebody's going to say, okay, what do you think? And I have a long paragraph. I am a bucket of seemingly idiosyncratic contradictions, all of which boil down to a single particular decision. If someone said to me, you can escape to Israel or remain here in the face of persecution, which would you do? And my answer is, I'm staying here because other Jews will too, and don't they deserve clergy support? And that is the entirety of my decision-making process. All the rest is commentary, which is to say, 3 days after the attacks in Gaza, I spoke at an Israel Solidarity event where a staffer from the Israeli embassy spoke. And yet I'm also engaged with Jewish clergy groups that are expressly pacifist, and I threatened to quit J Street's rabbinic cabinet for advocacy over specific congressional resolutions. So I'm a mess, and don't expect great straight answers out of me. I'm weird, and I'm okay with that. So we got to our Q&A and discussion with hopefully enough time to cover some topics. The plan is to kind of wrap up at 8:30, and so part of why I powered through was so that we could have as much discussion time as possible. I am going to end the recording so that we no longer have to worry about what we are saying and whether